It's the SDG Podcast. Before we get started, you can check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com/podcast or find us on all the social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.
All right. Today we got Dan Shui joining us. Hi, Dan. And we got Chad Jutner, Peter Lawrence.
That's me.
And me. I'm Kyle Bacher. And today we're going to talk about the trillion, billion lines of code that you guys are going to go through and make efficient and small and modular and awesome.
Line by
Code
line.
Bloat. Dan, you shared an article on Slack that got everybody thinking about Code Bloat.
Yeah, this is me being the crotchety old guy that's been doing this since like the late 90s when there was no such thing as a full stack developer. There was just a web developer. And there were not all these front end frameworks. You might do a little bit of straight JavaScript, but so the one of the things I've noticed, the project I'm on right now, which is a React, we have 2.5 gigs of JavaScript dependencies in our node modules directory, which is where you put all of your JavaScript libraries in a React app. And so it struck me, the first computer I had, and it was late in my career when I got one, it was the 90s, 1.5 gig hard drive. So I'm like, what is going on?
1.5 gig. I didn't even know that was possible in the 90s.
Yeah.
So I remember there was always the hardware upgrades, and then the software would follow it, like the size and, of your Office apps and your games and all that would you just have to keep upgrading to keep up with all of that.
Yeah.
They seem to get more and more bloated, more functionality.
But we're
talking about the custom apps and stuff that you guys build, and how much of that do you have to deal with?
So if somebody were to say to you, are all of your JavaScript dependencies secure, and you have 2.5 gigs of them, how would you even answer that question?
Well, you'd go looking for a tool that somebody wrote that tells you that they're secure by going through each of them, right?
And then everybody would feel better until the data breach happens.
Well, I deal with this all the time, though. We do have tools that actually identify vulnerabilities, and they cross-check your dependencies against, NIST databases and all these other vulnerability databases, and wonderful. I love it. Every time I find a new vulnerability in a dependency that I pull in, be it a JavaScript framework or a Java library or anything, it always improves velocity and makes things, no, none of that happens. I hate it. Man, we pull in so much garbage, well, not garbage, right? But we see hey, I don't want to check if an array list is empty. I'm going to use this Apache Commons library that's going to do the null check and the empty check and make sure it's actually populated with blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, man, sometimes bloat is just pulling in a dependency on another library to do something that you could have just done yourself a lot. And that library you pull in does not just the one little thing that you wanted to, but probably 1,000 other things. And one of those, and the odds of those 1,000 things all being done in a safe manner are practically nil. So what am I saying?
And how many of those 1,000 things are you using? Right.
Well, in defense of the JavaScript bloat, there is this process that prunes stuff that's supposed to go through and figure out which code is actually getting executed and try not to load stuff that's not and that kind of thing. But
the minute you pull that library into your framework, and maybe you do the the minify thing where it actually does prune everything else out and only deploys what you're using. I don't know. Things are weird right now. It feels like, with all of the nervousness around data breaches, with all of the tools around checking for vulnerabilities and all of the things that we plug into our CI/CD pipelines to make sure that we're deploying safe, secure code that has proper test coverage, that has proper everything. It's a miracle that we can actually deliver products kind of a timeline. It seems like software developers in our hearts, mostly for ourselves. And we do this to ourselves. A very depressing podcast episode.
Well, okay. Let's turn it around.
You went a little dark.
It is a challenge.
I was just having this conversation with one of my buddies on my project. I'm like, man, we developers don't hate anybody as much as we hate ourselves, right? And we just constantly do it to ourselves. And we do it with a smile on our face saying, hey, we're going to make our lives better. This one little library, this one extra little thing, it's going to make everything just slightly better. And then...
Well, the other part of that too, though, is in defense of us programmers, the guy behind Stack Overflow had an article years back. I think it was him. Don't quote me. It's either him or Joel Spolsky or somebody, but had a blog post titled "Nobody is smart enough to program," and he made a really good case that we're really not. Like, evolution did not prepare us to program computers. And so we're doing our best. And yeah, there's smart people in the software development industry, but nobody can keep track of gigabytes of switches, which are what bits are, right? If you string 50 trillion bits together, each one is a logic gate. Nobody can possibly wrap their head around what's happening, really. And that's why we have high-level languages, which make it a little easier, but it's,
I think you're talking about Jeff Atwood. That's
Jeff
the guy,
I
right?
believe so, yeah. I believe it was Jeff Atwood. Yep.
And
That's
he had
a deep
blog
cut.
And he had a blog called Coding Horror.
Coding Horror, yep. I believe that's right. Yep.
Yeah.
And you can find online, nobody is smart enough to program.
I do remember reading something along those lines. And at the time, though, I was building things that were magnitudes of scale smaller than what I'm doing today. And I kind of read that. I was like, come on, man, really? And now today I'm like, oh God, right? Like, we're building, not only are we producing code at a rate that is insane, but like just building applications that are much, much larger than, at least I am doing things that are much, much larger than anything I've done before in my career, like easily 10 times as big as, my next biggest project. And I actually did, there's a number of tools out there. So we're talking about code bloat specifically, I think, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of tools out there to count lines of code, right? And there's actually, speaking of code bloat, there's a software project out there on GitHub that literally does, for the type of project, for the language that you're typing, I think it's literally called LOC, lines of code. He goes out there and he does, analysis on how many lines of this project are actually your code. And I did one, and it turns out that I'm working on something. We've written War and Peace 8 times over now. We're on our 9th. And that's code that we've actually written ourselves. And if you think about that, though, that's insane. Like, that is absolutely bonkers. And we're still adding to it.
All right, let me ask the old developers on here. What's the smallest project that you worked on professionally?
Probably a brochure website for my first gig for STG, which was basically a static HTML site.
Nice. My first gig was probably, I don't know, we had tools at that time because we were doing, dynamically linked libraries and, a lot of other C++. And I've just gone up from there. Chad, you were going to say?
Yeah, I wrote, so I used to support infrastructure for a large local retailer. And they had a support staff. So I used to, there's probably the smallest deliverable I've ever written, wrote in Perl using CGI.pm, if you guys remember that.
Oh, yeah.
CGI, yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote a tool for our offshore team that was literally just 8 big buttons that they could press to do certain things because we didn't trust them with full access. But it was basically just restart this. Flush this cache, flush our connection, or flush our JDBC pool. I wrote that was the smallest thing I think I've ever wrote it in Perl. Yeah.
Did you write it straight Perl? Were there other Perl libraries that you brought in, or
CGI.pm? Baby, I don't know why we needed any other web development libraries after CGI.pm. It was all in there. We had routing, we had nothing else.
Nothing else.
Not a whole
There
lot.
you go.
See, that's what Google should be. It should just have 2 buttons. One should say "Show me cat videos," and the other one should say "Other."
It does have. It had got a button that says "I'm feeling lucky." Is that still there?
Yeah, it's still there. So here's another alarming statistic. I remember seeing. I don't know if anybody knows Uncle Bob. He's kind of well known in the tech speaking community, and he was at Minnesota Developer Conference years ago before the COVID times, and I saw him speak, and he brought out this chart, this exponential curve that depicted the number of software developers since 1960. In 1960, it was in the hundreds worldwide. Now it's, of course, in the millions. And he showed that every 5 years, since 1960, the number of software developers roughly doubles, which means that at any given time, half of everybody in the development community has less than 5 years of experience.
Wow.
So we're throwing a lot of inexperienced people growing exponentially onto these ever-growing code bases. So you have more code and more people that don't know that much about code working on it.
So that's part 2, dev bloat.
Yeah.
We have.
Well, conversely, though, like you have probably you're going to have a huge drop off of people retiring and brain drain, right? Like, I mean, I don't think I'm speaking out of school here when I say between Dan, Peter, and I, we've all been doing this since the 90s, and we're probably we're within the last decade of
we're a little tired.
Yeah. A little.
Long in the tooth.
Look at how much smoke is in your office, Dan. I feel like you are more than a little tired.
You do what you do to cope, Chad.
Yeah, man, crack a window. But I mean, all of our experience is going to leave with us, right? And it's a little different for us. Like, right, we're consultants, so we don't stick around at any given company for longer than, a handful of years. Right. But like a lot of these large organizations, I have buddies that are retiring now from huge local, like Fortune 100 companies in Minneapolis. They're retiring and they're retiring with them a ton of like domain expertise, knowledge, and everything else, and they're passing that on to somebody like Dan said with 5 years experience, and that's right. It's an interesting problem, but those people with those that little bit of experience are going to start patching to the best of their ability these massive code bases out there, and it's not going to go well.
I mean, so this is just to be able to participate in this conversation as somebody that is low code. I see this with WordPress plugins. I see this with Nintex workflows, where you got way too many actions, way too much going on. Maybe your project was where you had a constant flow of changing requirements and you're refactoring all the time, and you end up with a big Frankenstein. And it affects the performance. And you're using tools. You're using third-party tools, and you don't control the code base for those tools. So it's I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge we face where we, throw in a plugin and our pages slow down. And, it's like, how much do you, it's like, I hope you don't commit too much to this. But if you go all in on something to do your design and all of that kind of held hostage, and then you're one update away from a problem.
Well, and low code doesn't mean there's not a ton of code. It means what you're using, you presumably don't have to write a lot more code, but somebody already wrote a ton of code for your low code solution.
So how much of this is shortcuts? Like, I'm just going to add this library that does it for me, but it also does a billion other things that I'm not going to use. It's
a lot of it. I mean, that's kind of why the Linux kernel was built the way it was. It was supposed to be like super modular, so you could just pick and choose little parts. But the world, the internet, the web development has not followed the principles of the Linux kernel development community.
JavaScript, to be fair, was a language that was written over a weekend, right? So.
And it wasn't supposed to be the language of the World Wide Web. That's not what it was intended for.
But here we are.
So I do, and sometimes you don't even realize it, right? So I do a lot of Java development, and I use a lot of a thing called the Spring Framework, right? And the Spring Framework it's the de facto standard for Java applications. But you pull in a library from the Spring Framework, and you might not even realize that you're pulling in half a dozen additional libraries that the Spring Framework has obfuscated for you. Like you're doing something in the Spring Framework, and all of a sudden it's pulling in, the Apache Commons HTTP client. You're pulling in Hikari JDBC pools. You're pulling in all these other libraries that, at this point you're kind of cognizant of what they are, and all of what you're kind of signing up for if you have any kind of experience. But if you don't, then it's really easy to have just this massive code base just for a simple, API, right? Like your Hello World API probably has hundreds of thousands of lines of open source code associated to it just for the Java framework itself.
Right.
I saw somebody did a post on some of the biggest software projects and code bases in the world. Google is up there. I mean, they have literally billions upon billions upon billions of lines of code across all their services. NASA is not, which is amazing to me. Like, is not as, it takes less code to launch a space shuttle. And we've known this, right? Like the old joke about having more horsepower in your pocket than most space shuttles have in the last however many years.
The TI-83 calculator I read had more computing power than the Apollo 13 moon mission.
Right. But I think it's more, there's more to it than that, right? Because delete and trim everything, right? Like you're not going to send the Spring framework into outer space.
No.
Because,
no,
it's not a...
No. And we're not doing firmware. We're not doing, writing code for automatic braking, anti-lock braking systems or airplane navigation systems. We're doing business software, which is its own nightmare, and bloat is not, nobody really pays attention to bloat in the business enterprise software space like they
There's
do
no penalty.
in the field. There is. It's in all these data breaches and stuff because nobody knows what all this code is doing, but people choose to ignore it, just like we kind of choose to ignore, the highway deaths. It's the price we pay for having an automobile-based society, and everybody's like,
well, there's like space in the vacuum left to fill. You look at performance. It's like, well, it's still performing just fine. So we're good. It works. We're fine. You do a project from start to finish. You tie in the libraries. How much do you want to spend? How much time, how much money do you want to spend going back and doing, code reviews and refactoring and all of that? You're up against a deadline. It's like, give us something that works and then we can move on.
I mean,
right.
Go ahead. Simply looking at technical debt, not considering all of the technical debt that we're acquiring along the way from other libraries, just your own tiny code base, your 9 copies of War and Peace. There's some technical debt in there, right? The edit. I mean, who knows how long War and Peace was in the rough draft, but I'm guessing the editor tightened it up a bit.
You think there was an editor for War and Peace? Dude.
Yeah.
That dude didn't leave anything out.
Okay, so we've identified where code bloat started. It started with War and Peace.
I just think, we say it in such negative... We're pulling in things, honorable intentions, right? We have good intentions. We're trying to be mildly more efficient. We're trying to be... we're trying to gain some velocity. We're trying to do a lot of things.
Don't create the wheel, right? That's been a mantra in programming.
Yeah.
Yep. If you can find a package that does it.
Well, and so that's a huge benefit, the modular stuff and pre-built things you can tie into, and that's going to speed up your project, but there's going to be a cost at some point.
Double-edged sword.
Is there?
Well, that's the question.
You don't know what it's doing. Your professionals that maintain your software systems can't possibly know what all those modules are doing.
Yeah.
So so we go back to hardware components and the room size computers of discrete components so that we know everything that it's doing?
Well, we're beyond, again, nobody's smart enough to program. We weren't designed, or we simply don't have the capacity to understand everything that's happening in a modern software system. It's beyond human capacity.
Yep.
At this point, there's no going back. The genie's out of the bottle.
And to your point, Peter, I don't want to write straight JDBC queries anymore.
No.
Right? JPA and ORM and all those tools have made our lives easier.
Right.
Now, I don't necessarily know that I need everything that Hibernate or whatever package you're using for ORM has to offer. But I do know that I like calling simplified repository. I like that a lot better than having to implement my own find all or my own find by ID or my own all of this stuff ad nauseum. Those libraries and those tools have made all of that stuff. Those have actually helped the problem, right? It's made the bloat less. That said, if there's ever an issue with a core library like Hibernate for us Java developers. And I think there's a .NET version of as well.
And Hibernate, yeah.
There you go. If there's ever a vulnerability in that thing, that's where it's almost like a Y2K problem. It's such an ubiquitous ubiquitous. Ubiquitous. Thank you. My gosh, it's not even meat.
Ubiquitous.
Ubiquitous. It's such a ubiquitous library. This is like it's like the Log4j thing that we had a couple of years ago.
Right.
Remember that? Like that library was so ubiquitous that it caused. I mean, it was almost a national crisis.
And I think the incentives are all misaligned, really, because the business wants to see added functionality, right? They always do. So that's what we all get incentivized to produce. But it's I remember like reading something about after 9/11, and there's all this hand wringing and what could the intelligence community have done. And somebody pointed out that, the person that like prevents 9/11 from happening never gets recognized because it was a non-event, right? So, But then the people that dropped the ball, supposedly, when 9/11 happened, get crucified. So there's no incentive for me as a software developer, really, to spend a ton of time trying to figure out what could go wrong with our software in place of delivering new functionality that the business can see when I do a demo next Friday.
Well, that was the same argument with Y2K, right? Like everybody, after Y2K happened, some of the dumbest people in the world were like, what was the big deal? Like nothing bad happened. You guys were all worried over nothing, which is exactly what you're saying, Dan. Like they glossed over the fact that so many of us worked ridiculous hours in order to make sure that like...
Yeah, you know why nothing happened?
Because we worked really hard.
Yeah, it's hard to recognize success when you see that it worked, right? You watch Australia, or I forget who was the first time zone to go, but you're watching them on TV and nothing happens, and you're like, oh, phew, we did it. We made it. No, we don't have to roller skate to work or anything.
Yeah, remember that? Don't dial 9/11 on midnight on the 2000 because we'll bring the whole 9/11 system down and like.
I remember people were like,
system.
Did you read Wired magazine in the late 90s? Like there were software developers like, yes, I'm learning how to tan hides because I work on railroad switches, and there's no way they're going to make railroad switches. So all the railroad cars are going to fly off the foot. Like it was just bonkers. The things that people were doing. And some of those guys probably rightly so, right? Like I know my brother worked for a large local bank, and some of the hoops that they had to jump through to make sure that everybody still had a balance of whatever was in their checking account on January 1st of 2000. Like that was a lot of freaking work.
Yeah. So I wonder if we're going to see like a black swan event in the software industry, like 9/11, like something that wipes out a major bank to the point where they don't know how to recover people's accounts or something in order to like send a wake up call about the problems and the exponentially growing software landscape.
Well, I think you look at something that is highly treasured, and I don't think there's anything more highly treasured than actual treasure, and it's being watched, and everybody knows, it's like, kind of how much money you got, or you should, and the banks are keeping an eye. I mean, there's a lot of eyes on money, so you hope that there's enough attention there to prevent any these issues from happening.
Well,
but the black swan event is something that's so rare, that's so far-fetched before it happens. Like it's do you want to go through life worrying about every possible black swan event that's going to happen? Like you can't can't achieve perfection that way.
A black swan event is by definition an event that nobody could have imagined or that nobody could have seen coming. That's the definition of a black swan event. And they do happen, and they will happen. Statistically, they always happen. They're just rare. Yeah, I mean, and the money these days, what is it even? It's electronic pulses in computer systems. That's all it is.
Gold.
It's magnetized partitions in physical media somewhere.
Are we going to start talking about NFTs again? Good.
I don't think, nobody's talking about it.
But right now, the banks are eating the losses when there's breaches. I mean, it's not just banks. Data breaches cost companies money, right? And so I'm sure a lot of them got insurance, which is one of the problems that happened in 2008, where all these banks had these questionable like loans. And like, I don't think these are any good. I'm going to buy some insurance so somebody else can eat it if they're bad. And so I'm sure people are doing that with data breaches and stuff because that's expensive. It can severely damage and we see it all the time, and it's kind of like people are kind of used to it now, it seems like.
And those breaches are because of the bloat. The code base is so large.
It's part of it.
So then there's the arms race between the white hats and the black hats, and they're almost like QAing your security by exploiting these vulnerabilities and then patching.
Like a lot of these vulnerabilities, yes, there's the Log4j thing, which was horrific. And then there's probably going to be another one. I forget what the previous Log4j type event was.
The worm?
The I Love You virus, that wasn't.
Monkey bee?
But it's not even, some of these aren't even necessarily related to software bloat. Like, what was somebody just posted something about the local ISP that got hacked, right?
Yeah.
And they got hacked. Yeah. There was
U.S. Internet.
U.S. Internet.
A whole bunch of emails from the last, I don't know how many years got.
Yeah. And they didn't necessarily exploit a hole in software. What did they do? They one of the URL things, URL checkers they exploited to get into their system. I forget exactly the vector that they used to access all that stuff.
And that U.S. Internet is not a bad company. I mean, I've worked with them in the past on a few occasions, and they seem to me to really have their act together. I think this can happen to anybody.
That's the point. It's like it's beyond our capacity to understand these systems to the extent that we can say confidently that there aren't major security vulnerabilities in them.
Well, I think you have to take reasonable precautions. You got to have a lock on your door. You got to have a light on your front step. You just have to have these things. But that doesn't mean somebody can't come up to your front door with a sledgehammer and get in.
For sure. And then what if you have a house that has 10 million doors? That's what our software is getting to be like.
That's a pretty great analogy, right? Like having a lock on your door is a very sane and reasonable solution to protecting your house. What about your window? What about this? I mean, what's in your house? How valuable are your belongings inside your house? Can somebody just throw a brick through your window? That's what happens. That's a great analogy for what happens with, if I was a bank, yes, I'm not going to have glass windows. I'm going to have bars and all of this other crap on my windows. That is what software is like. It's all of the tools, all of the things that we're encountering writing business software are our best attempts at locking additional doors, putting bars on our windows and everything else. And as much as it sucks, it's the alternative is.
Yeah. So with code, what are the reasonable, measures you should take to, and not just security, but to handle the bloat? Do you have rules you have to follow? Do you have as you're developing, what do you do to kind of mitigate that stuff and take those reasonable precautions?
I mean, as an individual developer, I try to write what I consider to be elegant code, the minimum amount of code I need to write to solve the requirement at hand. But, I'm just one. And again, I think there's just too many doors now. Nobody knows if they're all locked.
Is there any good news?
Maybe it's starting to, again, I've started seeing this stuff show up in my news feed, which is curated by an algorithm that I don't really know very much about. So I don't know if that says more about me than it does about the culture at large. Maybe we're hitting a tipping point. I don't really know, but at some point, the drum beats, people, it's going to be like in what Chad pointed out, there's going to be a wave of retirements, and are there going to be enough people left to prop up all of this stuff? Because software doesn't die. It tends to grow in one direction only. And it's the rule of entropy. It's just the more software you have, the more
software you have.
The less order. It's harder to impose order on it, I guess.
I kind of wonder, Dan, if all of the vulnerabilities and all of the common sense things that we do, right, as almost second nature, will become fresh vulnerabilities once our generation retires. I'm trying to think of an example of some of these. Gosh darn it, I can't.
SQL injection,
encrypting passwords,
basic input sanitation, SQL injection, all of that stuff.
Not putting your passwords in your code.
Passwords are going to become a thing of the past anyway. But all of the common sense things that we just kind of do and build around. I wonder if that's going to become a brand new vector for the next generation to attack, because they are all retired,
Yeah. I mean, there is some good news. Like we've got an automated Veracode scan that runs. I just had to fix issue that Veracode found where we were taking an ID from user input and using that to call an external API and with a query string. And the Veracode is like, hey, like you didn't check this input to see if they're like creating a malformed URL when this thing goes to your third-party API. So I'm like, hey, good catch. So I basically called this other team and said, hey, we're using an ID from your system. Can you tell me every character I can expect to see in that ID formatting so that I can do a regex to make sure there's nothing other than those? So there's some good news. There's some, that was a good catch.
I mean, honestly, the automated tools have come so far. AI is probably going to play a role in that, right? As you tell the AI what's bad code, it can go through the billions of lines of code and look for that, right? Instead of having a human go through it. And hopefully your UI doesn't,
Yeah. It's like trying to find a spelling error in War and Peace. Peter, can you just start on page 1?
I'm just going to slowly page through it, look at all the words and make sure they're all spelled correctly.
Yeah, please do that.
Well, I think, with the worries about AI, there's also great hope. We talk about the generations that are, aging out and who the torch is getting handed to. They have better tools and all of this stuff available to them. They're starting with that advantage. The disadvantage is that they are in the world of, they're in the results of the code bloat that's come before them that they have to deal with. But hopefully the tools and the AI will kind of cover that gap,
right,
so that, businesses don't just shut down because there's no one that can keep their stuff running.
Well, it's an economic issue for businesses too, and it's at some point they'll realize that, because I was at a client years ago and they had a BizTalk implementation that was taking new registrations and feeding stuff into a table in a database when people signed up for this particular client. They were paying BizTalk licensing fees and nobody knew what it was for. So they actually asked me, I got permission to do kind of moonlight for them via SDG to do like a side project to replace the BizTalk thing with a REST API, so they could stop paying those licensing fees. So we did that. That was fine. They let it run for a year on my new API thing before somebody figured out that nobody used the data at all and they didn't need it for anything whatsoever. And so then they had a mock funeral for this thing, for this piece of software, which was called the master person table. But they were spending thousands of dollars a year to feed data to this table that nobody needed, but nobody knew if they needed it or not. That's another problem with Bloat.
Yeah, that's true. Getting tools that control how many times this table has been accessed in the last year is probably right around the corner.
Then we have content bloat. There's so much content.
AI is going to make that worse.
I just, did a little exercise today. Peter mentioned my broken Yeti microphone that we used when we first started our podcast, and I found like 20 videos addressing design flaw that it had, where if you turn it the wrong way, pulls on the USB cord and bends it and wrecks the port. And did that many videos need to be made about that one problem?
20 different ways to change a tire.
So back to code bloat. What are the reasonable steps? What do you do, as you're developing, going through that process?
Refactor, code reviews. That's really, I mean, we had at OSN last year, we had a wonderful presentation by a developer at one of our local companies. And I think basically what he was getting at is one of the most wonderful things to do as a developer is to delete code.
So fun.
It's your best tool against bloat is deleting code, refactoring out common themes in code. I mean, this borderlines on anti-patterns, kind of, but build your own string utils. I mean, I think a lot of the things that we pull in are convenience methods from open source libraries. So I'm a big fan of Apache Commons, or I had been in the past. So I'll pull in an entire util for string utils. Yep. There's 3 or 4 different libraries now that I pull in just for logging. Do you need them all? I mean, maybe one of your best tools right now to prevent Bloat is just to reevaluate what you really need. Like I kind of go on autopilot with fresh projects. I'm like, oh yes, obviously I need Spring, I need Spring Boot. Spring Boot's going to pull in SLF4J. SLF4J is going to be a facade for this other library, and that other library is going to probably need to pull in this if I'm, like all of that nonsense. Just stop for a minute and re-educate yourself on what the true necessities are. Maybe you'll find out that autopilot mode that we've been on for a little bit isn't always the most efficient,
Right. People are not questioning things enough, I feel like. Me included.
Yeah, exactly. You used a lot less words to say what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Do you vet the libraries you're using?
Via static code analysis and stuff and like community source, but no, I mean, no. Can you look through a library and understand it? No, not really.
No, and compilers of old and JavaScript, compilers and minimizers and things like that are doing their work to pull out the things that you're not using before it goes out. So you may see 2.5 gigabytes of node modules, but they're not all getting loaded. Yeah. You're not loading that onto somebody's computer every time they load your website. That would be fun.
But there is a cost, even though that's certainly true, and there's good software solutions for that kind of problem. It's still, from a developer, when you come into a project that's just massively sprawling, it's taxing cognitively from a developer perspective, and that has economic costs too, because it's hard for a new developer to come in and feel confident about what they're doing in your system if there's a million moving parts.
So keeping things simple, the KISS principle is always the way to go, right?
Yeah, and think about the people that are coming after you. Just, what is it going to be easy for them to understand what's going on? Because otherwise you're just being selfish, man.
If it was hard for me, it should be hard for them too. Come on.
Yeah.
We've heard that mantra from a few old developers.
I suffered, you should have to suffer too.
I mean, I've worked with guys that have been supporting the exact same software product at a large company, and it's amazing. Like, I'm continually impressed by their ability to recall, like things they did 20 years ago. But also, I mean, there's entire swaths of code where they're like, "Oh, I forgot about it. I don't remember this." And I think that's one of the biggest like things that we have to guard against is like make your code base modular enough so that it's supportable, right? Like, it's, I don't know. I mean, microservices kind of help with this a little bit, like having discrete things happening all over the place. But like these dudes, when you build a monolith, you're building a monolith and you've got like basically like two guys supporting the entire Taj Mahal. And that's not a recipe for success. So,
hey, so I was on the open source North Committee to look through the speakers. So I saw some of the talks, and one of them is about the return of the monolith. The pendulum is swinging the other way. People are getting burned out on microservices now.
Yeah.
So some parting thoughts. What I'm getting from this is that there's some kind of inevitability, and it's like just the expectations that's put on developers. In this world we find ourselves in, I think can be misaligned. And give them a break. It's like it's the same. Everybody's swimming in this pond. It's not there. I don't think there's an easy answer for it.
All right. My parting thought is: be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Don't look for code bloat. Do delete things. Do get rid of code. Don't just let it sit there because, I don't really know what it does, so I'm just going to ignore that rather than I'm going to dig into that and see if we really need it.
Lock your doors. Locks on your windows.
Yeah. Be vigilant. Ask questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't really have a parting thought.
All right. I think with that, we can wrap it up.
All right.
Fun talk.
Say goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody. See ya.
Solution Design Group is a digital product consultancy in Minneapolis. Check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.